Hi, everybody. My name is Tom.
And I'm Jacob.
And this is English Digest, and today is our history unit for the month of January. Today we're going to Britain, the UK, and we're going to be talking about something called bricked up windows and why people had to pay taxes on having windows in their houses and how that led to some windows being bricked up. That is really, really weird.
It is kind of weird. Now, if something is bricked up, basically, what you do is you have a hole in something or you're trying to cover something up and then you use bricks to do that. So imagine instead of having glass in your window, you might have a hole there. And so how do you cover up the hole? Well, you brick it up. You pile bricks in the hole, in the space there, and then you no longer have a window.
So that's the topic of today's lesson on history. Let's get to it. Let's read through the entire contents and we'll be right back. You're walking down a typical residential street in London. You've just spotted an old house with many of its windows bricked up. That's bizarre, you think to yourself. Soon you see a second house with bricked up windows. What's going on? You've just witnessed some interesting consequences of Britain's window tax. The window tax was introduced in 1696. At the time, income tax was thought to be an unreasonable idea. Instead, in what was considered a progressive move at the time, the window tax was brought in. The idea was that wealthier people lived in larger houses. Consequently, they'd have more windows. So a 2-shilling base tax, amounting to about a day's pay for a skilled worker, was charged on buildings with up to 10 windows. Properties with between 10 and 20 windows had to pay a further 4 shillings, and those with more than 20 windows had to pay 8 shillings more than the base rate. In 1766, the lower tax threshold was adjusted to 7 windows. The problem was that many poor people lived in large buildings that were split into multiple apartments. However, the window tax didn't calculate these as independent dwellings. Landlords bricked up windows to avoid the tax without understanding what this action's effects would be. The lack of air and sunlight was a recipe for unhealthy living conditions. Cases of epidemic diseases swiftly rose, drawing criticism from many parts of society. Writer Charles Dickens openly opposed the tax, saying, "Neither air nor light have been free since the imposition of the window tax." The window tax was abandoned in 1851 after being replaced by the income tax a decade earlier. It has left behind an interesting legacy, though. Many houses are now built with bricked-up windows to add character. It's funny to think that what was once considered a controversial modification is now desirable.
Welcome back, everyone. We're talking about Britain's bricked-up windows and their very interesting history. Now, this is something that I didn't know anything about. I'm not British, and Tom, you're not British either. So, yeah, this is a very interesting thing. It's kind of like how a government policy led to people doing something to their homes in a very interesting way. And we're going to find out that it's kind of come back. You know, people are having this idea, this longing for the past, let's say, and they're actually building houses now with these bricked up windows as a kind of way to call back to the past or the history, let's say, of Britain.
And we did talk about what bricked up means. Basically, you have windows and you get rid of the glass and you replace them with bricks. And so you don't have a window anymore and you won't have to pay tax. We'll talk about the details of that in just a second. So let's suppose that you're in England as a tourist. So here in the first paragraph it says, you're walking down a typical residential street in London. Okay, so imagine this scenario. You're walking down, a common, ordinary, typical residential street in London. And residential refers to an area or a thing where people live. Okay, of course, cities have different areas, like you have commercial areas, you have the business district, and then you have residential areas, like for, I guess, Taipei here, Nangang and Neihu and Wenshan would be primarily residential areas.
Okay, so yeah, residential meaning where people live, where they have their homes. You've just spotted an old house with many of its windows bricked up. Okay, so you've spotted something, an old house, and again, we talked about what bricked up windows are. It has many of its windows bricked up. That's bizarre, you think to yourself. Okay, bizarre is a great word because it has a Z in it. You know, Z isn't a very common letter, so whenever we see a Z, we can be kind of happy or excited. That's bizarre, you think to yourself. Bizarre means strange, weird, different, let's say. So yeah, so that's different, that's strange. I've never seen that before. That's bizarre, you think to yourself.
Yep, you're imagining that to yourself. You don't say it out loud. You're just talking to yourself there. And soon you see a second house with bricked up windows. So that's even more bizarre. And what's going on? You're asking yourself. This is weird. Am I missing something? Well, you've just witnessed some interesting consequences of Britain's window tax. So if you're from England or Scotland or wherever, and you walk around and see this stuff, oh, you've seen it before, you know what it is. It doesn't really catch your attention. But if you're a visitor, it's going to seem strange, unusual, bizarre, weird, or odd. And here we've got the word witness. That means you see something that most people don't get to see. Maybe you witnessed a crime, or maybe you witnessed a traffic accident, and it was kind of disturbing to you, and you had bad dreams about it later. But here, yes, you've just witnessed this. You've just seen this. It's an interesting consequence of the window tax that Britain used to have.
Right. Now, witness here is a verb. It can also be a noun, right? If you are a witness to a crime, the police or someone may ask you to go appear in court and to testify or to tell your story of what you saw. You are a witness, okay? And so then you will go to court and the lawyer or whoever will ask you questions. You'll answer truthfully, and then you will help someone make a decision about the crime. If you witnessed someone doing it, then you can ID them. You can say, yes, I saw that person do it. They're guilty. Okay, you will help solve the crime. So witness can be a verb or a noun. You can be a witness. Okay, so you've witnessed some interesting consequences of Britain's window tax. What is the window tax? That's what our next paragraph talks about. The window tax was introduced in 1696. Oh my gosh, that's a long time ago.
And yes, indeed, at the time, income tax was thought to be an unreasonable idea. So, of course, we've got different kinds of taxes. We've got, I guess, gas tax, alcohol tax, tobacco tax, sales tax, and income tax, which we all have to pay every year unless we don't have a job. But at that time, people thought that income tax was unreasonable. You guys can't do that to us. You government can't take part of our salaries away. That's unfair. It's unreasonable. So instead, in what was considered a progressive move at the time, the window tax was brought in. And I suppose this is sort of along the lines of the idea of taxing people with money more than those who are poor, so then the government can get more money that way to build roads and finance the army and stuff like that. So they thought, hey, this is a pretty progressive idea, the window tax. Therefore, we don't need the income tax and people won't be so upset.
Right. So something that's progressive is thought of as being more advanced or more modern, let's say, than something that's traditional or old. Okay, so yeah, progressive means, more modern or better, let's say. So the idea was that wealthier people lived in larger houses. Okay, that makes sense, right? If you have more money, if you're wealthier, you probably have a bigger house than someone who is less wealthy or not as rich, let's say. Consequently, they'd have more windows. Okay, so you have more money, you have a larger house. Larger houses have more windows. Having a window is nice because it lets in sunlight, it lets in air, it makes your house more comfortable, right? If you have bigger windows and more windows. If you live in a house without any windows, yeah, it's going to be stuffy, it's going to be dark. It won't be very nice. So consequently, they'd have more windows. So a 2 shilling base tax, amounting to about a day's pay for a skilled worker, was charged on buildings with up to 10 windows. Okay, so we're explaining a little bit about the basis of the window tax. A 2 shilling base tax. A shilling, I think that's sort of an old-fashioned kind of money that they used in England, right? The shilling?
No, I think it's 1/20th of a pound, and they don't use that anymore. I think they use cents and stuff like that, or pence maybe. But in any case, it was a tax basically, and that was the base tax. So if you had a the base tax would be 2 shillings, okay? That was the most base form of the tax, the lowest amount you would pay, and that amounted to about a day's pay for a skilled worker. So back then, before inflation, that was actually quite a lot of money. That's how much you would make in one day if you were a skilled worker, and that was charged on buildings with up to 10 windows. So if you had a building with up to 10 windows between, I guess, 1 and 10, then you had to pay this tax. And we'll talk more about the window tax as our lesson continues, but we'll take a break now and turn things over to our Chinese teacher.
大家好，我是派老师。今天讲解的是1月份 Unit 5 Britain's Bricked Up Windows Have an Interesting History。这是一篇文意选填的练习题，而文章内容相当有趣。大家有没有看过被砖块堵起来的窗户？如果大家有机会到英格兰或苏格兰走走，很可能会看到这种奇特的景象。这些 bricked up windows 背后有段有趣的故事。原来会用砖块堵住窗户是为了避税。好，我们先一起解题吧。请看第一题，我们从题目的前2段开始看起。Soon you see a second house， 一直到了 window tax 这边结束。文意选填的作答技巧就是先判断空格内单字的词性，再根据前后文筛选适当选项。由于空格前面是及物动词 witnessed， 我们需要在选项里找个名词作为 witness 的受词，再按照前后文文意从选项里过滤，我们挑出 B consequences， 填入以后检查文句是否通顺，有没有前后连贯。那这句话的意思就是你刚刚见证了英国窗户税有趣的后果。第一题选 B consequences。 接着我们看第二题 instead 这个句子。前文提到窗户税是1696年开始课征的，当年大家认为所得税并不合理，所得税不能收，取而代之的是当时大家认为相当进步的做法。请看到题目，窗户税怎么了？由于前文才提到窗户税17世纪末开始课征，我们应该从选项里找个文意相近的，所以选 E brought in 跟 introduce introduce 是同义词，都表示推出什么政策做法。 The window tax was brought in， 窗户税就推出了。第二题选 E brought in。 紧接着是第三题 So 一直到 10 windows 这题，同学不要被中间很长的插入句转移注意力了。主词 a 2 shilling base tax 2先令的基本税，空格后面是有10扇窗户以上的房子。从前后文我们可以推论出，这里应该是要表达房子如果有10扇以上的窗户，就要课征2先令的基本税。这一题考词语搭配 tax 配上哪个动词表示征收呢？我们选 J charged。
We're going to take a short break now, but please stay tuned. We'll be right back. Okay, let's continue talking about the window tax. We're talking about the base tax. Okay, that's where we left off. If you lived in a house up to 10 windows, or that had up to 10 windows, then you would pay a base tax of, let's see, what was it? 2 shillings. Okay, 2 shillings. And that was actually quite a bit for people at the time. It was a day's pay for a skilled worker. And properties with between 10 and 20 windows had to pay a further 4 shillings or 4 shillings more, and those with more than 20 windows had to pay 8 shillings more than the base rate. So as you have more windows in your home, then you pay more tax. So I guess for rich people, if you have lots of windows, you'll have to pay more and more tax.
Right, so think of 20 windows. A house has how many sides? Typical house. 4 sides, let's say.
Yeah.
And if you have windows on each side, 20 divided by 4 would be 5 per side. Yeah, that's not unreasonable. I mean, you know, if you have a nice house, you might have 4 windows or 4 or 5 windows per side. So people will pay more based on how many windows their houses have. It's very strange, you know. We don't really think of this as being a possible way to tax people these days. But you know, back in 1696 in the 1700s, this is how they taxed people in Great Britain. They taxed them based on how many windows they had in their houses.
I think windows are more important at the time because they did not have electricity. So, of course, they had to get a lot of light from outside. And, of course, they didn't have air conditioning either, so they needed to open their windows to have fresh air in there. So, yes, windows were more common. Nowadays, you know, with electricity and air conditioning and heating, it's possible for us to actually live in homes without windows at all. Although I like having windows because you get the light and stuff like that. But in any case, back then, people had windows and you had to pay tax accordingly. Now, let's move up to the year 1766. In 1766, the lower tax threshold was adjusted to 7 windows. Okay, so it was up to 10 windows before, and now it's 7 windows. And here we've got the word threshold. Threshold often talks about your door in your house. Basically, it's like a board or a piece of wood or metal that's the bottom of the doorway, and that's basically where your house starts. You cross the threshold and go into your house, but in this particular case, it's like the lowest point where you start paying taxes. Anything below that, then you don't have to pay tax.
Yeah, it's kind of like a minimum, right? M-I-N-I-M-U-M, minimum. Okay, so yeah, the minimum amount or the lower tax threshold was adjusted to 7 windows. The problem was that many poor people lived in large buildings that were split into multiple apartments. Okay, right. You can see that here in Taiwan. There might be a big building, but inside there are many smaller units. It's not like one family lives in this huge building. The building might have maybe 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or even more units or apartments. I think what is called like a hu here in Taiwan, right? Different apartments or units. Okay, so yeah, these large buildings, and they're split up. And poor people or people with less money, let's say, lived in them. However, the window tax didn't calculate these as independent dwellings. Okay, a dwelling would be a residence, an apartment, a home, let's say. So, right, the window tax didn't think of it like that. They thought of the whole building. The building as a whole is how they determined the tax. They didn't think of it as one apartment has 2 windows. No, it's one building has 20 windows or something like that. This to me sounds like it's a very basic problem with the window tax. How can you base it on the building and not base it on the apartment, let's say?
Yeah, so if you're the landlord, of course, you have to pay the tax. If you're the poor people, you probably don't need to worry about it too much. So the landlords bricked up windows to avoid the tax without understanding what this action's effects would be. So they thought, if I brick up the windows, that means there are no windows for them to count. So therefore, I would have fewer windows, and therefore I would not need to pay the tax, okay? But they didn't understand or maybe didn't care what this action's effects would would be. So what kind of effect would that be if you lived in a small apartment or a small flat with no window? Well, the lack of air and sunlight was a recipe for unhealthy living conditions. That sounds reasonable. If you don't have fresh air coming in, you might have germs and bacteria and viruses and stuff, and you might get sick there. And if you don't have any sunlight coming in, well, sunlight is good for your health. Of course, it produces vitamin D when you get exposed to sunlight, but it also benefits us in many other ways. So yeah, if you don't get any sunlight and if you don't get any air, you could get sick really quickly.
For sure. Cases of epidemic diseases swiftly rose, drawing criticism from many parts of society. Okay, cases of epidemic diseases swiftly rose. Okay, an epidemic, you may have seen that word in the past year or two. We talk about the COVID-19 epidemic. It started as an epidemic. Now, an epidemic is a sudden outbreak of disease in a specific area, let's say. So when COVID-19 started, it happened in China, right? In Wuhan, China. That's where it first started. So we can talk about an epidemic there. Now, another word similar to epidemic that you might have seen is pandemic, Pandemic. We talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, a pandemic is kind of like an epidemic, but it means that it spreads. It spreads around the world to different countries and things like that. So what a disease might start out as an epidemic, but then it can expand into a pandemic. Okay, so cases of the epidemic diseases swiftly rose, drawing criticism from many parts of society. Criticism is basically harsh words for someone. If you say something mean about someone, you give them criticism. It's not really friendly or not really nice to give someone criticism. It basically means you have very strong words or harsh words for them, probably about something that they've done wrong or something that you don't agree with. You give people criticism.
Right. I don't think they understood what bacteria and viruses were at the time, but they did understand that some sicknesses can spread. They didn't know exactly how, but they knew that they could spread. So, of course, people realized that these poor people living in these apartment blocks were getting sick, and probably because they had no windows. That was probably the cause. So they started to criticize this policy of the government. And then we had Charles Dickens, who lived around the time. Writer Charles Dickens openly opposed the tax, saying neither air nor light have been free since the imposition of the window tax. So indeed, even Charles Dickens was getting on the bandwagon here to oppose that tax. Now, in the final paragraph here, it says, the window tax was abandoned in 1851 after being replaced by the income tax a decade earlier. So I guess they finally got people to accept the income tax. Before that, remember, they thought it was unreasonable, but now they had the income tax. The government had income, so they did not need the window tax anymore.
And it has left behind an interesting legacy, though. Okay, this is what I mentioned in the beginning here. You have new buildings, and they are having these bricked up windows. This is the legacy of the window tax. A legacy is something that happened in the past, or something that comes from someone in the past, and it's kind of handed down to us today, to people in the present day. In the U.S., we often talk about the legacy of slavery. Slavery was an institution in the U.S. where people were not free, African Americans were not free, and that institution of slavery still has a lot of effects on people's lives today. So we talk about the legacy of slavery.
Yep, it's left something behind that we still need to think about and we're still affected by. So many houses are now built with bricked up windows to add character. So they don't really need to do this, but because they did it for a while, because it's kind of a tradition, or at least it was a tradition, some people in Britain actually brick up their windows just because it looks cool and it sort of has an historical legacy. So it's funny to think that what was once considered a controversial modification is now desirable. And remember, something's controversial when people have different opinions about that thing, especially in society. Here in Taiwan, like relations with China, that's something very controversial. Different political parties have different ideas about that. Or in the United States, gun control is controversial. Some people think we need to control them. Other people say, no, we need to have our guns to defend ourselves. So, of course, that's controversial as well. And, of course, you might see that if you're a tourist in good old England. Okay, that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. Let's listen now to our Chinese teacher.
接着第4题 In 1766 这个句子意思是说1766年窗户税门槛空格到7扇窗户。请注意上一段文章提到房子如果有10扇以上的窗户就要课征窗户税。这等于说纳税的门槛原本是10扇窗户，到了1766年又再变7扇，等于门槛调降了。因此第4题选 D adjusted。 好，我们接着解第5题，请看第5题题干。延续着前一句，也就是第4题的句子，窗户税课征门槛降低有什么问题呢？问题在于很多清寒人口居住在大房子里，可是这些大房子是分割成很多空格。我们知道介系词 into 之后必须是名词，再进一步用文意筛选，大房子切割成很多公寓套房，因此第5题我们选择 G apartment。 再来第6题，第6题按照文法判断应该在定冠词之后 of 之前填入名词，现在我们再用文意判断。前文提到即使房东把大房子切割成空间较小的公寓套房出租，政府并不会因为同一间大房子里有不同的承租户而有不一样的做法，所以房东为了避税把房子用砖块堵了起来。请大家想想，窗户堵住以后空气和阳光会怎么样呢？就缺乏阳光和空气了。因此第6题选 A lack。 我们接着看第7题 Cases of epidemic diseases swiftly 怎么样呢？没有阳光，缺乏空气对流，形成的生活条件会危害身体健康，流行病的病例很快的空格，引发社会各界批评。从文法判断，主词是 cases of epidemic diseases， 这个句子还需要动词，考量前后文连贯，因此第7题选 C rose， 这是不及物动词 rise 的过去式，表示增加。第8题，窗户税在1851年空格，在于此10年之前呢，是由所得税所取代。be 动词过去式 was 之后，我们可以填形容词作为主词补语，或过去分词做被动语态。考量前后文，所以第8题选 F abandoned， 窗户税在1851年废止。接着请看第9题，依据文法，我们需要一个过去分词造成现在完成式。根据前后文，我们选择 I left behind， 表示然而这留下了很有趣的文化遗产。第9题选 I。 最后第10题，第10题空格 What was once considered a controversial， 过去一度被视为有争议的什么，可填名词作为补语。考量文意，我们选 H modification。 以上就是我们针对这一篇文意选填所做的解题讲解，谢谢。
That is it for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and please join us again next time for another edition of our program, and enjoy your trip to England if you're going anytime soon. From all of us here at English Digest, I'm Tom.
I'm Jacob. Bye-bye.